right, welcome to part two of these lectures, or of this lecture rather. Part one addressed Nietzsche. Part two is going to address Saussure. But what we're talking about is the turn in rhetorical theory that happened at the beginning of the modern era. And what that turn consisted of was a problematization of the idea of meaning and how meaning takes shape and occurs. And whereas in the past it was thought that meaning making itself is not a rhetorical phenomena, that is, that meaning was just a natural function of language use and had nothing to do with rhetoric, the modern turn in rhetorical theory sees meaning making as a distinctly rhetorical phenomena that unfolds in the context of language. So in part one of this video, we talked about Nietzsche's On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense. Now I want to talk a little bit about Saussure's insights in his course in General Linguistics. He's kind of the father of modern linguistics, and as we go along here through the text, periodically I'll make some comparisons to the ideas that Nietzsche advanced in On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense. So Saussure says that language is a well-defined object. Language as a well-defined object. And I think the objectivity of his idea of language is important, and as we'll see, he views language as a structure, a conceptual structure. And so there's two parts to language. There's what he calls the langue and the parole. The langue and the parole. And the langue is the system of signs. The sign in this case is a basic conceptual unit of meaning within a language. Okay? So the long part of language is the system of signs itself, that object, that structure of language. Okay? The parole are particular instances of speech. Parole are particular instances of speech. And so a particular instance of speech is a statement that is rendered possible by a logic that by which the system of signs operates, right? Okay. So he says, he notes, and this is of interest, that language is human, speech is not. And, this is going to come as a blow to some of those of you who think that your dog talks, right? Your dog doesn't talk, at least not by a linguistic definition. Your dog does speak, right? Dogs and cats and animals make sounds, right? Those sounds, though, don't have a structured meaning. Now, you might say, oh, but when my dog is scared, he makes this sound. And it's like, yes, they make sounds that correlate with specific emotions, right? But those sounds are effects of an emotional experience rather than a semantic expression, of that content. And so that's to say they don't have a content. Humans speak and have language. That is, our language is a semantic, conceptual articulation of inner experience. And that's different than just speech, okay? And so he's interested in how language works as a human phenomenon. And he says that language isn't simply a name-giving enterprise. And he's critical of people working in language earlier who acted as if language is as simple as looking at a new object and saying, let's call that microphone. Let's call that wall, right? He's more interested in how does language achieve meaning? How does meaning making function in the context of language? Okay. And so his question is, he really has two questions. If language is a system of signs, signs being words or, as we'll get to see, signifiers, if language is a system of signs, how does the sign work? Number one. And number two, how do signs structure this system? Okay? So 2 questions. How does a sign work? How does the mass of signs structure the system of language? All right, so what's a sign? He gets into this definition specifically. A sign is the unification of a signifier with a signified. A sign is a combination of a signifier with a signified. Okay. The signified is the thing out in the world that the sign refers to. Okay. The signifier is what he calls a sound image. A sound image. And we'll talk a little bit more about what he means by that in just a second, right? But for now, the sign is the unification of the signifier and the signified, or the unification of a sound image with a concept. Okay. So let's say, for example, there is a thing called a squirrel. Okay, a squirrel. And note that the instant I said squirrel, if you're an English speaker, this picture popped up in your head of squirrel, right? Of the little animal with the bushy tail that lives in the trees. All I have to do is I can send out different sounds and call up pictures for you of things out in the world. Rabbit, you just had a picture. Lion, you just had a picture in your mind, right? And so what I'm doing is making sounds that correlate with an image, right? This unification of a sound with an image at the psychological level is one half of how the sign works. The other half of how the sign works is the concept, the thing out in the world, the actual thing. In other words, you understand that when I unify this sound and this image to say squirrel, what I'm talking about is an actual thing that exists in reality outside of the structure of language. Okay? And so it's the interaction between these two things that enables meaning to occur. Okay? And so the ways that the sound and the image are bound are very complicated, right? It has to do with language acquisition itself. And the concept, in its relation to the signifier, for the signifier we could just think of word or sound, right, that indicates a word. The signifier is the thing. I'm sorry. The signified is the thing. The signifier is basically the sound that reflects the thing. Okay. So, he points at a metaphor that he uses to describe this unity between the signifier and the signified as a piece of paper, right? It's got two sides, but you can't separate the two sides from one another, right? They're part of the same thing. Two different sides of the same thing, and that's what these are. The same thing they're a part of is the sign, the meaning-making unit within the larger system of language. So Saussure goes on to talk about how the signifier is arbitrary. What's that mean? Well, I suppose that in sort of contemporary colloquial speech, we'd say it's random. In other words, for any object in the world, any name could have been given to it. Literally any name. Any name. In the last video when we were talking about Nietzsche, I think we said that, you could call the refrigerator lettuce. People won't understand what you're talking about, but maybe at some point when the refrigerator was invented, and the invention of it is in quotation marks, as we saw in Nietzsche too, right? But when it was invented, right, we could have called it lettuce. But just because the name is arbitrary doesn't mean that you have any ability to change it. right? So yes, it's just arbitrary that we call the guitar a guitar and not something else. But you can't say, well, because it's arbitrary, I'm going to call it something else anyways, right? Because then nobody understands what you mean when you use that other word. And so this shows the social, rhetorical dimension of the signifier, right? The way that the signifier necessitates some unstated doxastic agreement that yes, this is in fact the signifier we will join to this signified. And nobody can change that, right? None of us can do any one thing to change what we call a guitar. In other words, that would have to happen at some much larger social level if we were to change how we refer to it. Okay, this obviously has implications for attempts to change language usage generally from the top down, right? When people say, well, you should use this word for that, you should use that word for that, right? But they don't get to do that unless they impose some kind of punishment or restrictive or coercive dimension, right, on sort of language use, because language use is formed by a social consensus, basically. All right, so the signifier is arbitrary but unchangeable. Now, why have this at all? Like, what is the function of the sign? Well, I'm going to erase some of this, by the way. So, Saussure says that objects and meaning become possible only through this linguistic process, right? Because what he says is that experience without language would just be experience of reality as a unity, as one thing. In other words, if you stepped outside and you had no linguistic ability, right, nothing would be differentiated from another thing. There would just be one reality. And so if you had no language, you couldn't go outside and say, the bees are in that tree, right? The shed is back there, and inside the shed is the branch clippers, right? All those recognitions of different things that are cut off from the larger reality of which they're a part of is an effect of the language system itself. And so, really, what signs do on their own is allow us to cut off a little chunk of experience, right? To make reality a little bit more manageable. And this conforms to what Nietzsche was talking about in On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, because if we remember, what he says is this language game called truth is really just an attempt to insulate ourselves from harm. And the way that we do that is by deploying this schema of truth in such a way that we can learn to predict, contain, and control the environment around us. And that's really very much kind of what Saussure is saying here. Now, to help you visualize this, right, imagine a baby, right? When a baby's born, they have no language ability, right? And probably what they're experiencing is not like, individual objects in the world around them. They probably just experience this thing outside of me where all these things are going on at once. Now, I don't know what your first word was. My first word was cup. And or so my parents tell me, right? And that moment when I was able to articulate cup, I want my cup, right? What I had finally done is cut off one chunk of that reality from all the rest of experience. So once I have one word, I have cup and everything else that's not cup, right? And then maybe I learn a second word. Maybe I learn mom, right? Now I've got two things, well really three things. I've got cup, I've got mom, and I got everything else, right? Then maybe I learn dad, right? And I cut off a little more of reality. And as I am able to conceptualize individual aspects of reality, I become much more able to control my environment. It's not just one big mishmash anymore, right? And so once you've really mastered a language and you have a capacity to use a wide variety of signs, you're able to say, Mom, please bring me my cup. Dad, I need to go to the store. Whatever, right? The language use, the structure of language, enables a management of reality. It enables objects, events, ideas to even become intelligible, to become distinguishable from the larger reality that they exist within. Okay. So signification is what we might call meaning making. And signification is the outcome of the interaction of signs, right? The interaction of signs enable meaning. That's how meaning takes shape. Now remember, language, he says, is a structure. And so the transition of meaning is enabled by the position of a sign within the larger structure of language. That's how meaning happens, okay? So let's talk a little bit about how signs are exchanged. I'm going to erase some of this again. Sorry. All right. So signification progresses, in other words, meaning making progresses by an exchange of signs. All right. So, like I might say, boy, that was courageous, right? And somebody might say to me, well, wait a second, what do you mean courageous? And imagine that we have somebody who doesn't have a very firm grasp of the language, and they say, well, what's courage? We're probably going to say something like, oh, well, it's bravery. It's when somebody's brave. Okay, right? In other words, we exchanged one sign for another sign. These are abstract conceptions, right? And we define one only by recourse to another. Now, we could give an example of a courageous act instead of saying, well, bravery, right? But then people will think, if they don't know what the word is, that it's only limited to that one act. In other words, we can't generalize this characteristic that is observable in a number of different places throughout reality. Now, imagine they say, well, what's bravery? And then we would again go something like, well, it's intrepidation, right? And so we did another exchange. We took their bravery and said, oh, here, it's an intrepidation, right? And so really, this is what's called a signifying chain, right? And we could, if they didn't understand trepidation, right, intrepidation, we could say, well, it's fearlessness. That's what courage is. That's what bravery is. It's fearlessness. Now, there are subtle differences between these ideas, right? Certainly, fearlessness and bravery aren't exactly the same thing. There's some difference there. But in the larger structure of language, if we think of a tower or some building, right, these do exist in some relation to one another. And their positions in that structure is what makes their meaning mutually intelligible, that I have recourse to other signs. Now let's imagine I didn't get anywhere with the synonyms, right? If the synonyms weren't helping you understand this, well, then I could go by antonyms. I could exchange it for a different thing. I could say, what's courage? Oh, well, courage is the opposite of cowardice, right? Courage is the opposite of cowardice. Or we could say, bravery is the opposite of fearfulness, of fear. Okay. So, in other words, this is a logic of exchange. Language and meaning-making works through a system of exchanges of signs. Okay? Now, the thing here is that we never get to the signified. If what the signified is the truth that exists outside of language, right? Language itself can never actually get us there. Why not? Well, because meaning making only happens happens through the exchange of signs. So every time you want to get closer to the truth by saying, well, tell me, what is the reality of this thing? All I can do is give you a different sign or a different system of signs. And what we might call this is the deferral of the signified. It's always put off, right? And so remember when Nietzsche said that sensory experience is making us make these huge logical leaps from one sphere of experience to another in an effort to say what the truth is? Saussure is talking about how distant language usage is from the reality of the thing that we're talking about, of truth. And so, right now, there's probably like 27 squirrels out in my yard because they're all over the place here. It's driving me nuts, right? All right, but so we start from the squirrel in my yard, right? And then I'm talking to you and looking for something outside in the world to reference, and I think squirrel, right? I get the sound image. So I get the thing, the little squirrel, I'll draw my squirrel. Right? There's my squirrel. There's the thing out in the world, the squirrel, right? Then when I think of it, I get the image, right? When I'm like, oh, I could talk about the squirrel. And so then there's that mental image that occurs when I remember this thing outside, which is just a representation of the real thing, right? So we're 1 degree removed from the real, right? And then I associate that with a sound. I see the image, and that's paired up with the sound image, and I hear that sound, the sound of the word squirrel up here, right? And then I speak it. I speak the word squirrel. So we went from the thing to the image to the sound to the speech to the externalization of the sound, right? And it's important to understand that in writing, and for the composition students in the class, this is something to think about. That what writing is yet another leap, right? The moment that I go like this, the moment that I go like that, we've taken a whole nother leap. Because what does this indicate? Right? Well, you're going to say squirrel the animal, right? But I'm like, no. Stop looking at this and seeing squirrel the animal. Start just seeing a series of squiggly lines, right? What does this series of squiggly lines represent? Well, what it represents is not the animal, right? What it actually represents is a series of sounds. What this really is a way to graph certain sounds. S, k, w, r, o. Right? And so what I've really done here is draw a picture of sound. And so when you see this picture, you're supposed to understand that what you're looking at is this particular sound, which produces this particular image, which references this particular thing. So when we're writing, and when we're teaching students to write, we're actually 4 times removed from the thing, from the actual real thing, from the real, right? And so all of these are just representations. And because the only way that we can define any of them is through recourse to another symbolic representation of the thing, we can never quite get here. Never quite get here unless I was to cage up the squirrel itself, bring it to our class, which is not happening anymore, or face-to-face, and set it down in front of you, right? Then you'd have the real. But instead, it's this deferral, right? And if you remember, like Nietzsche said, like, if humanity wants to have truth, right? Truth that gets played through a language naming game, then we have to be content with what he calls empty husks. And what he's talking about there is words, right? That these words signify something, but that what enabled us to do that signification, to construct that meaning making, is an erasure of difference, which requires us to distance ourselves from the truth of the thing rather than bring ourselves closer to it. And therefore, these words, maybe they're truths, but if they are, it's an empty husk of a truth that doesn't get us towards the real. And so the communal aspects, the interactive aspects, both linguistically, socially, structurally, that enable meaning making to happen are distinctly rhetorical phenomena, This is distinctly rhetorical, and it's rhetorical in a way that really didn't occur to many of the earlier writers and rhetorical theorists that we've read this semester. So as we proceed reading this semester, our reading list will increasingly be attuned to the ways that language itself, meaning itself, structure experience, and the way that rhetoric structures meaning and in turn experience. All right, that's all. If you have questions or anything, comments, put them down in the comments spot below. Stay safe, wash your hands, do your homework, love your parents, love your fellow man. Bye-bye.